All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're tackling one of the biggest questions out there, a real head-scratcher that's been on people's minds for, well, basically forever. And it all boils down to one simple but massive question. How did we get here? And I don't just mean you and me. I mean all of it. How does a totally empty, lifeless rock, 4.5 billion years ago, eventually become a planet teeming with everything from tiny bacteria to massive blue whales? That is the core mystery we are trying to solve today. Okay, so before we can even start looking for the origin of life, we kind of have to agree on what life even is, right? So here's our working definition. Life isn't just a thing, it's a process. It's something that can reproduce, it can grow, and it can turn stuff from the outside into energy for itself. So we're not just looking for some magic spark, we're looking for the beginning of this whole complex system. Now, for most of human history, we didn't have any of the cool science gear we have now. No labs, no microscopes. So our first stabs at solving this mystery, well, they were basically just guesses based on what people could see, which led to some really interesting but ultimately dead-end ideas. And while these early theories were all over the place, you had ideas about a supernatural creator, you had the theory that life hitched a ride on a meteorite from space. There was even one idea that life didn't have a beginning at all, it just always existed. But the one that really stuck around for a long time was this idea that life could just, poof, appear out of nowhere. Get this. This belief was so common that a chemist back in the 17th century wrote down a literal recipe for making mice. You just need a dirty shirt and some wheat. I'm serious. This is the whole idea of spontaneous generation, in a nutshell. People would see maggots on old meat or frogs in the mud and just figure, well, I guess that's where they come from. It sounds completely bonkers to us now, but for hundreds of years, this was a perfectly reasonable explanation. And that is the big problem, right? All of these were just ideas. They were hypotheses with zero rigorous testing. To really solve this case, the mystery had to get out of the philosophers' armchairs and into the lab. And believe me, the game was about to change. So this is the turning point. This is when scientists start rolling up their sleeves and designing these really clever experiments to put these old ideas to the test. And their number one target? That whole life from nothing theory? They stopped just looking and started properly investigating. Take Francesco Redi's experiment. It's so simple but absolutely brilliant. He puts meat in 3 jars. One's open, one's covered with gauze, and one's sealed shut. And what happens? Maggots only show up in the open jar where flies could get in and lay their eggs. Boom. He proved that maggots don't just magically appear on meat. They come from other living things, flies. This was a huge blow against spontaneous generation. But, old ideas die hard. People started saying, okay, fine for maggots, but what about tiny things, microbes? And that's where the legend Louis Pasteur steps in. He designs this genius swan neck flask. Air can get in, but any dust or microbes from the air get trapped in that curved neck. And guess what? The broth inside stays perfectly fresh. But then, and this is the best part, he tips the flask just enough for the broth to touch that chapped dust, and bam, it goes bad. Case closed. Life only comes from other life. Okay, but hold on a second. This leaves us with a massive paradox, doesn't it? If life can only come from other life, then where did the very first life come from? Proving spontaneous generation doesn't happen now doesn't help us figure out how it all kicked off billions of years ago. We've just swapped one mystery for another. We need a whole new theory. And that brings us to the prime suspect in our investigation, the modern chemical theory. This is the big one, the leading idea today. And it basically says, you're right, life can't just pop into existence today. But early Earth, that was a completely different world. It was the perfect crime scene for non-living chemicals to get together and create that very first spark of life. Just try to picture it. The atmosphere has almost no oxygen, which is actually a good thing, because oxygen would have just destroyed the delicate molecules we need. Instead, you've got this thick soup of gases like methane and ammonia. And for energy, you've got nonstop lightning storms, volcanoes erupting everywhere, and intense radiation from the sun. And, the most critical ingredient of all, you have time. So much time, almost 1 billion years for all this chemistry to just cook. So here's how the theory works, step by step. First, all that energy zapping those raw materials creates the basic building blocks, things called monomers. Step 2, these little guys collect in the oceans, forming what we call the primordial soup. Then, over a long time, these monomers start linking up, like Legos, into more complex things like proteins. And finally, these new complex molecules start clumping together into little bubbles, kind of like the first prototype of a cell. Now, this sounds like a pretty good story, but is it just a story? Is there any actual proof? Well, this is where things get really cool. In 1953, two scientists, Miller and Urey, decided, enough talk, let's try to do it. They built a contraption in their lab to recreate that crime scene, the atmosphere of early Earth. The big question was, could they make the building blocks of life from scratch? And the results were absolutely mind-blowing. They actually did it. After only a week of letting this thing run, zapping their chemical soup with sparks like lightning, they looked at the gunk at the bottom and they found amino acids, the very things that make up proteins. They even found adenine, a component of DNA. Now, they didn't create a living thing, let's be clear, but they created the ingredients for life from non-living stuff. This was the smoking gun. It showed the theory was possible. So you take that little experiment and you imagine it running not for a week, but for hundreds of millions of years. That whole process is what we think led to the very first, very simple cells showing up on Earth about 2 billion years ago. That first spark had finally caught fire. Okay, so we've got a really solid theory for how that first cell came to be. But that's just a single cell. How do you get from that to, well, all of this? The rainforests, the oceans, us? The investigation is far from over. The origin of that first cell wasn't the end of the story. No way. It was the starting gun for a whole new chapter, and that chapter is called evolution. Evolution is the how. It's the process that explains how that one common ancestor could branch out into millions of different forms, adapting and changing over billions of years to fill literally every corner of the planet. And the evidence for this is everywhere you look. Think about it. Your arm, a bat's wing, and a whale's flipper. They all have the same basic bone structure. Why? Because we all evolved from a common ancestor. That's what we call homologous structures. But then you have something like a bird's wing and a butterfly's wing. They both do the same job, flying, but they are built completely differently because they evolved separately. Those are analogous structures. These kinds of patterns are like the fingerprints that evolution has left all over the living world. To really get it, you have to look at the timeline. It is just immense. Earth forms way back here. For billions of years, life was just tiny, simple cells. Then you get fish, then dinosaurs, and then way, way over here at the very end, that's us, mammals and humans. We are so new to the scene, it's not even funny. It just goes to show you what a long, slow, and absolutely incredible journey it's been. And that leaves us with one last mind-bending question. We've pieced together the clues for how life got started here on Earth, a story of the right chemicals, the right energy, and a whole lot of time. But if that recipe worked here, what about out there? Across the billions of other planets in the universe, could there be other crime scenes out there, right now, cooking up their own versions of life? Suddenly, the mystery we started with seems a whole lot bigger, doesn't it?